When we look at the research, there are three things that great teams have in common. The world runs on teams. I believe that the organization, the invention of getting different humans together to collaborate on a project, is probably the greatest invention in the history of mankind, because through organizations, we've been able to build and create value that any individual entrepreneur, any individual laborer would have never been able to imagine. And organizations are built on teams, hence the world runs on teams. So it's worth asking, what do great teams have in common? What are the things that teams that create consistent amounts of value, that overperform expectations, the teams that win again and again, what are the things that they all have in common that underperforming teams lack, that teams that actually perform far less than expectations failed to grasp? When we look at the research, there are three things that great teams have in common: intellectual diversity, psychological safety, and a purpose or a cause worth fighting for. And we're gonna look at all three in turn in this video. But before we do, we should say that these things apply no matter what team you are on. We live in an age where face-to-face teams are not the only type of teams that are being built. Some teams are geographically dispersed and entirely remote. So whether you collaborate in the boardroom or whether you collaborate in a Zoom meeting or a Skype call or a WebEx, no matter where you collaborate, no matter where you team, you need these three elements to become that great team. Let's look at each in turn. The first thing that great teams have in common is intellectual diversity. Intellectual diversity. Now, this term is actually used most often on college campus debates about whether or not there are enough conservative voices or liberal voices captured on any given college campus or department. And that's not exactly what we're talking about here. Although that, the political spectrum, is one perspective, one axis that we need to be judging diversity on. It goes a lot deeper than that. Often in corporate America and in businesses as a whole, we use diversity as a substitute for racial or gender diversity. And those are two very, very important ones. I'm not criticizing that. But racial and gender diversity are a proxy for this broader intellectual diversity. Intellectual diversity is the reason we are seeking out greater diversity metrics, right? Because people who come from different backgrounds, who have different life experiences, have different perspectives. And ultimately, the job of a team is to solve problems. Creativity is a team sport, but if everybody comes from the same background, everybody comes from the same college or the same type of college, everybody comes from the same, again, racial experience growing up or gender experience growing up, then the ideas that they come up with might be really, really similar. So when it comes to teams, we need to be looking deeper than just those metrics. And do we have a diversity of perspectives, a diversity of experiences, a diversity of a wide range of things, so that when it comes time to understand the problem, we can see it from a lot of different viewpoints, and we can see it from a lot of different perspectives. One of my favorite studies actually shows gender diversity does this really, really well. The more women that are present on a corporate board, for example, the better decisions that board makes, the more profitable the company is. I think it goes that way for almost any way that we can measure diversity, because what it provides is that intellectual diversity underneath. It provides us the opportunity to see the world from a lot of different perspectives, to generate solutions to problems from a lot of different raw material of ideas from past experiences. And that's going to bring us to a greater solution. Creativity is a team sport. Problem solving is a team sport, but only the teams that have enough intellectual diversity to see the totality of the problem and understand how to judge the full spectrum of solutions are going to end up winning in the end. Intellectual diversity is a core piece of the recipe of what makes great teams. But it's not the only piece. Now, the next piece of the recipe is psychological safety. And this is important for largely a similar reason to the idea of intellectual diversity. I mean, it's 2020. If you don't recognize that you need diversity, both racial, gender, and other forms of intellectual diversity in your organization, I can't help you. But the struggle that many organizations are dealing with right now, though the struggle that many teams are dealing with right now, is that that diversity of ideas is not accompanied by a welcomeness of those people to share their full selves, to share their full experiences. They're there, but they don't feel like they can contribute. And this is where psychological safety comes in. Psychological safety is quite simply the measure of how free someone on a team is to share all of their ideas, to share their whole experiences, to share their whole selves. And it applies not just on the diversity side, but whether or not people feel willing to make mistakes and admit those mistakes, or willing to submit crazy ideas that might lead the team in a different direction, but that direction ultimately provides genius. As a leader, the most important job that you have on a team is to develop this concept of psychological safety, to let people feel vulnerable, to let people feel like they can risk putting a creative idea out there, and the idea might be judged, but they as a person will not be judged. You see, that's the thing that happens as we as teams try and get into solving problems, and creativity is a team sport. The primary role of teams is to solve problems. As people try and generate solutions to those problems, if they don't feel free to share all of their ideas, then they deprive the group of those ideas. But also, if they feel like when they do, they are judged, they will gradually feel less free to share those ideas. One of my favorite studies, probably the foundational study of psychological safety, is from Amy Edmondson, and it was a study of charge nurses running wards in a hospital. And the idea that Edmondson was looking for was that great leaders would actually have better rates of performance and lower mistakes and things like that. But as she dove into the data, she found that the leaders that were judged to be the best by their team were actually the ones that ran floors that had more mistakes documented, more errors documented, medical errors, etc. And when she dove into interviews to try and figure out why good leaders led to more mistakes, what she found was that it wasn't about the more mistakes, it was about the documentation. Great leaders created psychological safety so that the nurses on that ward felt free to admit their mistake, receive the correction, and that everybody could benefit from the learning that happened after the mistake. Whereas poor leaders didn't create enough psychological safety, so the individual nurses felt like they had to hide their mistakes, and in doing so deprive those teams of that learning. It's only when we have psychological safety, it's only when we have this feeling that we can contribute our whole selves, that we can take risks, and that we can admit mistakes, that we as a team begin to actually benefit from that intellectual diversity piece. So intellectual diversity and psychological safety go together to make teams great, but they're not the only thing that great teams have in common. There's one more. Oh, hey, Dave, you're on mute. Sorry about that. The third and final element that a great team has in common is a purpose worth fighting for. We've known for 20 years the importance of a shared vision, a shared mission, a shared purpose, but those terms have been too vague for a lot of people to really use to gel a team together. And they don't introduce what I think is one of the key things for getting a group to bond and work together towards what the research literature would call a superordinate goal. That thing is some level of adversity, some level of stakes. It's not enough to say what you're working for. What are you fighting for? And the teams of people that study what causes people to actually join revolutions, reformations, insurgencies, the team of researchers at Artists International in particular found that when a purpose is elevated from this is something we're working for towards this is a future that we've decided is worth fighting for. When you do that, you do two things that groups that don't have that elevated level of purpose have. The first is that you elevate core values to the level of sacred values. When something is so important that it is worth fighting for, when there's a norm or some acceptable thing going on in an industry that you as a group can say, we find that unacceptable and we are now working to change the status quo, that's a sacred value. That elevates it to the level of a fight. When you can take core values and elevate them to the level of sacred values, something that we are willing to plant our flag and say, we will not compromise on this issue, or we will not compromise in our fight to move this issue forward, to create this performance so that we can change the world. When you have something that is a purpose that rises to the level of a revolution or something worth fighting for, you create a sense of group identity that isn't otherwise formed by just a shared vision. Purpose, mission, vision, they're all hugely important. But when you look at the great teams, the teams that consistently create value, the teams that change the world, they would say their purpose was worth fighting for. So there you have it. Great teams have intellectual diversity, psychological safety, and a purpose or a cause worth fighting for. Now, all three of these aspects require the act of transformational leadership. They require a leader, whether that's an individual or whether that's a group of people acting in the role of leadership, they require someone to say, hey, we don't have enough viewpoint diversity here. We don't have enough racial or gender diversity here. We need more perspectives, and let's go out and find new members of the team. They require a leader to make sure that every voice is being heard. They require a leader to self-disclose his or her own vulnerability so that followers develop a sense that they can disclose and they can take risks and they can share mistakes as well. And they require someone to put to words the vision and mission that is on the hearts of all of those people. Someone to provide them with that clear and concise answer to the question, what are we fighting for? So what do great teams have in common? Great teams have great leadership in common. Whether that's one individual or whether that's multiple people who contribute in turn. Great teams have intellectual diversity, psychological safety, and a purpose worth fighting for. And all of that comes through great leadership. Hey, thanks so much for watching this episode. If you enjoyed it, make sure you're subscribed to the channel because we post episodes like this as often as we can. And if you really enjoyed it and you want to go deeper, then check out our totally free course, 3 Days to a More Motivated and Aligned Team. You can sign up for it at davidburkus.com/3days. We'll see you there.